Hi, welcome back to my channel. Now, I love a Western. The Western is probably my favourite film genre of all. It kind of vies with the horror film. Ever since I've been a child, I've loved them. I first fell in love with the Clint Eastwood Man with No Name trilogy, which I used to watch with my dad. And then I got into the films of Sam Peckinpah. So basically, I was coming in on what are called the revisionist westerns, right? My dad used to watch the classic westerns with John Wayne and James Stewart, which I could never really get into when I was young. But later on, I did fall in love with them and I realised that they were brilliant. And now I'm always on the lookout for any western from any era that I love or think is interesting. And last night, I saw a film. I'd never heard of it really. I didn't know anything about its reputation. And it blew my head off. It was called Rio Conchos. And it was directed by Gordon Douglas, who previously I only knew from the sci-fi movie Them, which is about giant ants in the New Mexico desert. Favourite film of mine when I was a kid. So I watched this movie, and I'm not kidding, five-star film for me. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. And it made me think there's so many movies out there in the Western genre that never make it to the top of these polls. And they're really, really great. And I wondered, what is the most underrated movie in the Western genre? And so I'm going to give you 8 nominees, films that I would pick as being candidates for the most underrated Western of all time. So let's kick off with Rio Conchos. It was made in 1964 by Gordon Douglas. And apparently it was very similar to a John Wayne film from a few years previously called Los Comancheros, which I have not seen, I have to be honest. The main character is a kind of Ethan character from The Searchers. He's a guy, he's an ex-Confederate officer, and his family have been killed by Apaches. So he's got a hatred of Native Americans, which the film does not compromise on. His prejudice is right out there in the open, and I think much keener and more stronger than that in The Searchers, actually. And he's going to be put on trial, but the cavalry officer who's going to put him on trial gives him a chance and says, look, we've had a casement of rifles that have been stolen from us. And we know that these rifles are going to be sold to the Apaches, and the Apaches are going to make a raid. We need to get them back. We need you to find this casement of rifles, undercover, and destroy, kill whoever is selling them to the Apaches. So off goes Richard Boone, the actor Richard Boone, who's brilliant in this central role of this Confederate officer. And he takes with him another fellow prisoner who's this kind of Hispanic con man, who's a bit of a ladies' man. He's quite a funny foil for him. And 2 cavalry officers, one of whom is played by Jim Brown, who apparently was a famous American football player. Never heard of him. Anyway, so these 4 guys go off on this mission into Mexico. And it really anticipates Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch, which I think is one of the masterpieces of the genre and one of the great American films. But it kind of gets there first. This territory of these, 4 American men going deep into Mexican territory to, with a casement of guns, armament stolen from the cavalry. It's all there in part of, the Wild Bunch plot. And what they find is Edmund O'Brien giving a barnstorming performance. That's a nice way of saying it, over the top. He's giving a barnstorming performance as this Confederate general who's fled to Mexico and is now setting up a new confederacy. And he's actually even built his southern home in the Mexican desert. And it's wonderfully shot and directed by Gordon Douglas, so the home isn't completed. So Edmund O'Brien is walking about it as if he's in his home with his cigar, but it's all open to the sky, a wonderful, simple metaphor of madness. And he's like this kind of Kurtz figure, so there's a kind of heart of darkness dimension to the story. And at the end, when the heroes overcome him, there's a wonderful shot where his house is now burning down, and he just walks back in the doorway and just closes the door, which is a gorgeous shot. So it's a film that's very, very tough. These 4 guys we're with are not likeable. They're full of prejudices, they're full of hatred towards each other and suspicion of each other, and the film does not compromise one iota. It's got a very tough script that was written by the same man who wrote the novel on which it's based, and it's an excellent script. And the characterisation is superb throughout. These guys, like the Wild Bunch in Sam Peckinpah's film, they're not nice guys. And it's not going to pretend that they are, but they are the people we're saddled with throughout the movie. It's superbly directed, beautifully edited, fantastic cinematography by Joseph MacDonald, who also worked on Sam Fuller films and with John Ford on My Darling Clementine. I love the colours in this film. I love the landscapes, which are very red, but the plants have had all the colours bleached out of them. So it gives a very sort of alien effect, a bit like Antonioni achieved in Red Desert, but then Antonioni actually painted the trees. I don't know if they did that here or whether they treated the colour in post-production or whether they filmed in wintertime to get a different kind of colour. And they also film in different terrain, in a swamp or in this sort of scrubland of stunted trees, and it gives it a really fantastic atmosphere. I can't recommend the film enough. It's an absolute cracker of a movie. Another film about the cavalry versus the Indians, as they used to say, Native Americans now, is this movie, Oldskins Raid. This was made about 10 years later in the early 1970s by Robert Aldrich, a great old-fashioned macho director of Hollywood. He's most famous for his film noir Kiss Me Deadly, one of the great apocalyptic noirs. And he also made a great piece of Grand Guignol Gothic with Betty Davis and Joan Crawford, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. And in the 70s he made films with Burt Reynolds like Hustle. I think this is one of his greatest achievements. It stars Burt Lancaster as an Indian scout who is helping the cavalry penetrate Apache country. It was compared by many critics at the time, it was thought to be an analogy of the Vietnam War. And that is apt because it's an extremely bitter, violent and dark film. It does not compromise on the violence, it's quite shocking. There's one scene in particular in this film that I cannot get out of my head. And that is, you see this young cavalry officer and he's on a horse, and behind him is this young woman who I think is his bride, and she's on a carriage with horses. He goes forward and he sees that they're being ambushed by Apaches, and he rides back to his woman, and you think he's going to scoop her up or save her, and instead he takes out his gun and blows her head off. Honestly, I cannot get that image out of my mind. That's how uncompromising, how grim this film is. Aldrich took advantage of the new lax censorship and the new realism in cinema, in American cinema, in the 70s. And it's a brutal film, but it's a brilliant one. If you can see it, do find it. It's really. This is a terrible cover, isn't it? But it's a much better film than this cover, gives it credit. The next film I want to talk about is Canyon Passage. Now, this is directed by Jacques Tourneur. Jacques Tourneur was a Frenchman working in Hollywood, and he's best known for his horror films. He made a trilogy of horror films with Val Lewton, Cat People, I Walked with a Zombie, and The Leopard Man, which are incredibly important in the horror genre. And he also made a wonderful horror film in the 50s called Night of the Demon. But he was a Hollywood director for hire, and he made films like Howard Hawks and Raoul Walsh. He made films in all kinds of genres, and he made some really, really good westerns, and he doesn't get enough credit for it. He made two wonderful films with Joel McCrea, Wichita and Stranger on Horseback. He made an excellent film with Robert Stack called Great Day in the Morning, a really unusual western, and I'd like to hear from anyone who knows of a good print available of that anywhere. But first of all, back in the 40s, he made Canyon Passage. This is one of the great westerns. First of all, God, it's beautiful. Beautiful 1940s Technicolor, all out in the forests, in the green forests. It's gorgeous. And it stars Dana Andrews, one of Tourneur's favourite actors and one of my favourite actors. He was best known, Dana Andrews, as the sort of nice but tough guy in a lot of film noirs and films by Fritz Lang. So it's unusual to see him in a western. But he's very good as this, this kind of scout who's he's gone back into the community, and he's running a logging business, I think, a freight business. And it's more, what I like about Tourneur is he's more interested, he's not such a macho director, he's not so much interested in violence or gunfights. He's interested in community and how the gunfighter or whoever gets involved in the community. The community, the world of the West, starts to seep into his films much more than it does, say, in the films of Hawks or, someone like Sergio Leone. And one of the most memorable scenes in this film is them building a barn together, the whole community coming together to build a barn. It's the great set piece of the film. That's what Turner brings to the Western. He brings a sort of calmness, a sort of subtlety, which is not there in many Western films, and what I think makes this film so special. So it's not a hard, tough, Western. It's more of a social Western, but I think it's very beautiful and it's worth seeing if you've never seen it. Now, another of the great Western filmmakers is Burt Boetticher. I actually learnt how to say that name. I thought it was Burt Boetticher, but I found out that it's pronounced Burt Boetticher. Anyway, he made a series of very famous films, the Renown Cycle, with Randolph Scott in the 1950s. I love those films so much. God. And the film The Tall T is one of my favourite films ever. I can almost quote the dialogue off by heart. Now, towards the end of his career, he made his last Western, right at the end of the 1960s, A Time for Dying. This is a very strange film. Now, the best way I can describe it is it's kind of like Easy Rider meets Babes in the Wood in a Western town. What happens is a young man and a young girl, they fall into each other's arms, really. Basically, she's taken a job in a Western town, but what she doesn't realise is it's a job in a whorehouse, and she's been tricked. And the boy saves her, and they ride off out of town, and they go to another town, and this drunken sot of a judge is the sort of tyrant ruler of this town, and his law is word. And he's kind of like a comic grotesque, kind of comic anti-hero. But he takes a shine to these young people. And they have a chance. They have a chance for romance and to get to know each other. And most of the film has got a sort of sunny disposition. It's like a sort of late 60s TV movie with a kind of tinny film score and sort of slightly gauche acting from the two leads. And you think, what is this? But you're being led up a garden path because you're being led to an ending which you just don't see coming. One of the most bitter, most cynical, most pessimistic endings in any Western. I don't want to spoil it. And it leaves you thinking, wow, what was that? Why did Boetticher make that film? But you can't really forget it. It has an impact on everyone who sees it, this film. It's a popular film with all sorts of strange people, like Chris Petit, who was an independent filmmaker in Britain, made a film called Radio On. Ian Sinclair, who was a sort of science fiction novelist and writer in Britain. A lot of people have claimed that this is one of their favourite films because it's so weird, because it's so left field. It seems like a sort of Romeo and Juliet in the desert, but something just as horrible as happens to Romeo and Juliet at the end of that tragedy happens at the end of this film. Watch it and see what you make of it. Now, the next film I want to talk about has got one of the best titles of any movie ever. Terror in a Texas Town. What a fantastic title for a movie that is. And Terror in a Texas Town stars Sterling Hayden. What a strange actor Sterling Hayden is. He's always on the cusp, isn't he, Sterling Hayden, of ham, of going over the top. But he just manages to stay that side of it. And here he plays this kind of Scandinavian immigrant in this Texas town who comes into trouble with the guys who run the place, the big heavies. And this is directed by Joseph H. Lewis. Now, Joseph H. Lewis is one of those B directors who French critics and critics in the 60s fell in love with because of the strange dynamism and joyful experimentation of his films. He's most famous for a film noir called Gun Crazy, which has a fantastic shot where the man and the woman, the young guy and the young girl who are robbing banks in the story, they're in the front seat of their car, and the camera was placed on the back seat behind them. And the whole robbery of this bank, you watch from the back seat of a car in one held shot. So this is the kind of director that Lewis is. He's a young buck who likes to try different things. He's dynamic. He's a bit crazy, and he brings that same dynamism into Terror in a Texas Town. It's a hugely enjoyable film, and it's most notable for the fact that Sterling Hayden's weapon of choice at the end to dispatch the baddie is a harpoon. That's just one of the many things that is so great about this film. Watch out for it. Now, talking of strange things, this double bill from Criterion, The Shooting and Ride in the Whirlwind, two films by the independent American director Monty Hellman. These were cheapo westerns made back to back in the late 1960s. The first one is where a woman, played by Millie Perkins, hires two men to hunt down this guy, played by the two men who help her are Warren Oates and a very young Jack Nicholson. It's a very pared down, cold western, which has a very avant-garde ending. Which I don't know if I really want to spoil it, but the film sort of almost collapses in on itself in a really intriguing way. But the film I'd really like to point you towards is its successor, Ride in the Whirlwind, which barely rates a mention ever. And this again features a young Jack Nicholson and also a young Harry Dean Stanton. And this is a movie that has intrigued me for the longest time. The story is these cattle ranchers, they hole up, they take shelter one day in this hut with these guys, not knowing that these guys are outlaws that are being chased down by a ruthless posse. The posse comes in, starts attacking, and these cowhands get confused with the bandits. So they go on the run. That's the basic story. The plot is not what's interesting here. It's the treatment of the plot. Hellman films this in a really stark, realistic, despairing way. There's almost something existentialist about this film, you know. There's a bleakness about it that is almost kind of spiritual almost. I remember when I saw this film as a teenager, the ending, at the end, Jack Nicholson gets away, none of the others get away, and he gets away and he just rides off down this valley. The dust swirls, silence, credits. That's it. And you're just left there suspended. You know that feeling you get sometimes with European art house movies? You get that same feeling watching this movie. Like, what the hell happened? Like, nothing's resolved, nothing... Where am I? What was the point? And it leaves you almost feeling a sense of fear almost. It's an extraordinary film. It got to me like no other Western got to me. It's a very small, spare, low-budget movie. But there's more to it. And that's what I like about this film. Sometimes you get an American film, a genre film, that hints at all those depths that you get in an art film. And Ride in the Whirlwind is a very good example of that. So check it out. Coming up to the 90s, we have another very strange take on the West, what I would call an acid western, Dead Man by Jim Jarmusch. This stars Johnny Depp as a kind of guy from the East, sort of fish out of water. He turns up in a western town, completely out of his depth. And sometimes by design and sometimes by happenstance, by accident, he ends up being a sort of angel of death. And all the people around him where he meets start dying. And he hooks up with this kind of young Indian chief called Nobody, who mistakes him for the poet William Blake. You're kind of getting an idea of this movie, right? It's kind of poetic, it's lyrical, with a slight tongue in its cheek. And there are sort of dream sequences where Depp sees this guy as having a skull-like face. And it all leads up to this extraordinary mythical ending where Depp, who's dying, is sent off in a boat, like a Viking, towards this distant horizon across the sea. It's very beautiful. It all adds up to a very strange, wry take on the start of the American dream and American violence. I find it absolutely fascinating. The more I watch it, the more I see in it. It's got a great cast, Johnny Depp, Lance Henriksen. I think John Hurt is in it, in a very small part. I can't remember. But wonderful film. Try it out. It's a bit different. And finally, coming right up to date, I thought I'd mention The Homesman. This was the second film directed by Tommy Lee Jones after the three burials of Melquiades Estrada. That got a bit of attention, but The Homesman didn't, which I think is a great injustice, because I think it's one of the great modern westerns. It's got an unusual storyline. Tommy Lee Jones is this kind of vagrant guy, really, and he's employed to help take 3 women across the desert. These women have gone mad. They've been living out, in the boondocks, in the wilderness, and they've gone crazy. And this woman, Hilary Swank, is trying to get them back to a refuge, back east, back where they can be safe. And she hires Tommy Lee Jones to help her. I think it's one of the best westerns I've seen in the last 20 years. Tommy Lee Jones goes back to the sort of classical western, right? He doesn't try to interfere with the genre, he just plays it straight, but with great intelligence and sensitivity, leading up to a very beautiful ending with Meryl Streep. And I really like this film. It's a different take on the western. Very well filmed. Tommy Lee Jones is as good a director as he is an actor. And I think it's a shame that this film didn't get more consideration, because I've not heard of Tommy Lee Jones making a film since. Perhaps he didn't because it wasn't very successful. But it really deserved to be. Give it a chance. I think you'll be impressed. So those are my 8 candidates for the most underrated western ever made. Let me know in the comments below other westerns that you like, that you think don't get as much praise as they deserve. And let me know what you think of the 8 films I've chosen. And if you like my content, please like and subscribe. Thanks very much.